Hey everyone! The United States has officially blown past $38 trillion in national debt. Take a moment to wrap your head around that number, $38 trillion. That's a 38 followed by 12 zeros. It's more money than most of us can imagine. To put it in perspective, $38 trillion is about double the entire economic output of the European Union, and it works out to roughly $115,000 for every single American, or nearly $500,000 for each child under 18 in the United States. It's an astonishing, record-breaking figure, and it begs the question, how on earth did we end up owing so much? Well, to understand why this is happening, we must go back in time to when it all began. The story of America's debt didn't start in the 21st century. It actually goes way back. The U.S. government has been borrowing money since the country's founding. In fact, after the Revolutionary War in the late 18th century, the brand new United States was already about $75 million in debt. That may sound quaint compared to trillions, but at the time it was enormous. Fast forward to the mid-19th century, and fighting the Civil War drove the debt up to over $2 billion by 1865. So yes, debt is nothing new in American history. The government has pretty much always owed money to someone. There was even one brief moment in 1835 when the U.S. federal debt was completely paid off thanks to President Andrew Jackson. But that didn't last long. Generally, from the Revolutionary era onward, the U.S. has carried debt and kept on accumulating more over time. Let's take a little historical tour to see how U.S. debt ballooned from those modest millions to mind-boggling trillions. Historically, big spikes in the national debt tend to happen during wars and economic crises when the government spends heavily to win battles or save the economy. Afterwards, the debt relative to the economy often declines during more peaceful or prosperous times. At least that was the pattern in the past. For example, World War II was a time of massive government spending. By 1946, U.S. debt had soared to about 106% of the entire economy, GDP. That was an all-time high at the time. The country literally owed about as much as the total value of everything it produced in a year. Yet the United States managed to avoid disaster. In the post-World War II era, late 1940s through the 1950s and 1960s, the economy boomed and the government practiced some fiscal restraint. As a result, the debt burden shrank dramatically relative to the growing economy, from that 106% of GDP in 1946 down to only about 23% of GDP by the late 1970s. In other words, for a few decades after World War II, the debt became a much smaller deal compared to the size of the economy. The U.S. didn't default or fall apart. It grew its way out of the World War II debt spike through a combination of strong economic growth and keeping budgets under control. But after that post-war golden age, things started to change. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, several factors converged to reverse the trend. Economic growth slowed, inflation surged in the 1970s, and the U.S. began running persistent budget deficits, meaning spending more each year than it collected in taxes. Let's highlight a few key milestones to see how the debt really took off in recent decades. 1982. This was a historic year. The U.S. national debt hit $1 trillion for the first time ever. $1 trillion of debt. It had taken over 190 years since 1790 to get to that first trillion. Keep in mind, the early 1980s was when President Ronald Reagan's administration was cutting taxes and increasing military spending, and the economy was recovering from a recession. Deficits were piling up and the debt was growing fast. 2008, fast forward 26 years from the $1 trillion mark. By 2008, the debt had skyrocketed to over $10 trillion. That's right, it took a little over a quarter century for the debt to multiply tenfold. What happened during those years? In short, America did a lot of spending and not enough saving. The 1980s and 1990s saw ongoing deficits as the government continued to borrow. There were tax cuts in the early 2000s, expensive wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the Great Recession of 2008 hit. Each of those events pumped up the debt. For instance, the wars in the Middle East meant huge defense budgets. At one point in the 2000s, military spending exceeded $600 billion a year during those conflicts. And when the financial crisis struck in 2008, the government suddenly needed to bail out banks and stimulate the economy. Under President Obama, Washington passed a massive $831 billion stimulus package to fight the recession and joblessness. That spending was probably necessary to prevent an even worse economic collapse, but of course it added significantly to the debt. On top of that, recessions cause tax revenues to drop because people earn less and pay less in taxes, which means the government has to borrow even more to make up the shortfall. So by the end of the 2000s, the U.S. debt had truly exploded. 2022, after 2008, the debt trajectory never really leveled off. In fact, it accelerated. The U.S. kept running big deficits year after year through the 2010s. By 2022, the gross national debt hit $30 trillion for the first time. Think about that. From $10 trillion in 2008 to $30 trillion in 2022, that's an increase of $20 trillion in just 14 years. Why so much so fast? A lot of reasons. There were some years in the 2010s where deficits shrank a bit. For example, around 2013, the deficit narrowed, but the overall debt kept rising. There were further tax cuts, like in 2017, taxes were cut significantly, which reduced revenue. Ongoing costs for programs like Social Security and Medicare were climbing, and interest costs on the debt itself were accumulating. And then, of course, COVID-19 hit in 2020, which was a fiscal game changer. 2020, 2021, COVID pandemic. We need to talk about the pandemic because it's a huge part of the recent debt surge. When COVID struck, the U.S. government essentially opened the floodgates of spending to prevent economic meltdown. Trillions of dollars were spent virtually overnight on things like stimulus checks, expanded unemployment benefits, loans to keep small businesses afloat, aid to hospitals, you name it. In 2020 alone, the federal budget deficit ballooned to about $3.3 trillion, roughly 16% of GDP, an extraordinary level not seen since World War II. The debt, which was already high, jumped by several trillion in just a matter of months. By early 2021, the debt was around $28 trillion and climbing. And the government didn't stop there. In 2021, another major stimulus, the American Rescue Plan, was passed, adding $1.9 trillion more in spending. All told, the pandemic response added multiple trillions to the national tab in a very short time. It was like fighting an economic war against the virus, and like any war, it was paid for with borrowed money. By the time the dust settled from the pandemic, the U.S. had gotten used to running trillion-dollar-plus deficits each year. Even as the emergency COVID spending subsided, other factors kept the red ink flowing. For one, government spending hasn't really come down to pre-COVID levels. In fact, federal outlays spending in 2023 were nearly 60% higher than in 2019, just before the pandemic. That's a huge jump in baseline spending over a short period. Meanwhile, tax revenues haven't risen nearly enough to cover that, partly because of tax cuts and partly because of economic factors. The result? We continue to have big annual budget deficits, which means even more debt every year. This brings us to the present decade, where the debt milestones started flying by even faster. 2023-2025, the debt crossed $33 trillion around late 2023, then $37 trillion by mid-2025, and now $38 trillion in late 2025. Think about that. It took the U.S. 209 years, from 1776 to 1985, to accumulate its first $2 trillion of debt, but in just the last couple of months in 2025, the U.S. added $1 trillion more in only 71 days. That's right. Essentially, in just over 2 months, the U.S. borrowed another $1 trillion. The pace of debt accumulation right now is staggering. Part of the reason it spiked so fast in 2023-2025 is actually a bit technical. There was a lot of delayed borrowing while Congress was fighting over the debt ceiling, basically the legal limit on how much debt the Treasury can issue. For the first half of 2023, the government hit the debt limit and had to use accounting tricks, extraordinary measures, to avoid defaulting. When the debt ceiling was finally lifted, the Treasury rushed to catch up by issuing a ton of new debt that it couldn't issue earlier. So we got this sudden leap. On top of that, if you remember, there was even a brief federal government shutdown in late 2025. And in just the first 23 days of that shutdown, another $382 billion was added to the debt because, ironically, the government still had to spend money even while parts of it were closed. In short, the trend line of our debt looks like a steep uphill climb lately. So here we are, over $38 trillion in debt. That number is so large it almost doesn't feel real, but it is real, and it has real consequences for the country. Everything I've just explained, you will understand them better when we are talking about some major factors behind the explosion of the national debt. It's clear that a lot of things contributed to this massive debt: wars, recessions, tax cuts, stimulus bills, you name it. But if we boil it down, the fundamental reason is simple. The government has been spending more money than it brings in almost every single year for decades. Yearly deficits are like adding just a little more to the national credit card balance each time. And over time, those additions snowball into an enormous amount. One analysis put it very plainly. 50 years of living just a little bit beyond our means got us here. In other words, since the late 20th century, under both political parties and through many administrations, the U.S. has chronically spent a bit more than it collected, funding big programs, cutting taxes, fighting wars, expanding benefits, without fully paying for it all. Each individual deficit might have seemed manageable at the time, but over about half a century, they piled up into trillions upon trillions. Let me highlight and explain some of the major factors behind the explosion of debt. 1. Major wars and defense spending. 2. Growing entitlement costs, programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. 3. Recessions and economic rescue packages. We saw this in 2008-2009. The financial crisis led to bailouts of banks and auto companies, extended unemployment benefits, and the big stimulus bill, ARA, of 2009 that cost about $831 billion. And of course, the COVID-19 recession in 2020 was perhaps the biggest example. The government poured in trillions in a short span to keep the economy afloat, which massively added to the debt in one go. 4. Tax cuts and lower revenues. And lastly, interest on the debt. Here's a catch-22. The more debt you have, the more you have to pay in interest on that debt. And that interest itself contributes to more debt if you're borrowing to pay it. For a long time, over the past decade or two, interest rates were very low, which kind of lulled us into complacency. Even as the debt was growing, the government's interest payments stayed manageable because rates were near zero for a while. However, that's changed now. With inflation popping up in 2022, the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates significantly, and suddenly the U.S. Treasury has to pay much higher rates on new debt. The impact is huge. Net interest costs on the debt have jumped 158% since 2019. The U.S. is now paying on the order of $1 trillion just in interest this year. That's interest alone, which doesn't buy any new highways, doesn't pay a single soldier's salary or a teacher's salary. It's just servicing existing debt. In fact, we're paying more in interest now than on our entire national defense budget. Nearly 1 out of every $5 of federal revenue is now going straight to interest payments, doing nothing except paying for past spending. This is like if you have a credit card and the interest charges have grown so large that they eat up a big chunk of your paycheck. You're stuck paying for yesterday's expenses, and it gets harder to afford new things today. Rising interest costs create a vicious cycle. They make deficits larger, since paying interest is a federal expense, which in turn increases debt further if we borrow to cover it. Put all these factors together: war spending, economic crises, tax cuts, growing social program costs, and interest, and you get the perfect recipe for a debt explosion. The U.S. national debt didn't jump to $38 trillion overnight due to one single event. It's the cumulative result of many years of decisions and circumstances. There's a famous line about going bankrupt gradually, then suddenly. In America's case, we've been borrowing gradually for a long time, and now we're suddenly at a precarious point. Okay, so we've traced how we got here, but you might be thinking, so what? The U.S. has been in debt forever. We've managed this long. What's the big deal with $38 trillion? The big deal is that the higher the debt goes, the more it can start to weigh down the economy and limit our future choices. Here are a few reasons economists and watchdogs are getting increasingly alarmed as the debt hits new highs. Straining the budget. As mentioned, paying interest on $38 trillion is extremely expensive, over $1 trillion a year in interest payments. That means less money available for other priorities. Every dollar going to interest is a dollar not going to, say, education, infrastructure, or research. If interest costs keep rising, they could crowd out vital investments. Officials warn that interest could become the single largest item in the federal budget in the future, surpassing even Social Security or military spending if we don't get deficits under control. That's like a family finding that their credit card interest is now their biggest monthly expense. Obviously not a healthy financial situation. Debt versus economy, debt to GDP ratio. One common way to gauge the debt burden is to compare it to the nation's GDP, gross domestic product, basically the size of the economy. Right now, that ratio is roughly 125%, debt about 1.2x the economy. That's one of the highest levels ever, comparable to the World War II peak. Why does that matter? Because if debt grows much faster than the economy, eventually investors might worry that the country can't keep up. Research suggests that when countries have very high debt to GDP for long periods, over approximately 77% according to a World Bank study, it can start to slow down economic growth. It's like dragging a ball and chain, not an immediate catastrophe, but a constant drag on forward progress. For the U.S., being at approximately 120% of GDP and on track for even higher, the Congressional Budget Office projects it will keep rising if nothing changes, is a warning sign. It implies we're on an unsustainable path, where debt grows faster than our ability to pay it off. Risk of a fiscal crisis. Now, to be clear, the U.S. has never actually defaulted on its debt in modern history. It always pays its creditors, often just by borrowing more or printing money if needed. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, and U.S. Treasury bonds are considered one of the safest assets out there. That's a big reason we've been able to rack up so much debt seemingly without immediate consequence. People around the world still want to loan the U.S. money. However, as the debt keeps climbing, investors could lose confidence. They might start demanding higher interest rates to compensate for perceived risk or shift money elsewhere. We got a glimpse of this in 2023 when a major rating agency downgraded the U.S. credit rating due to political fights over the debt and the sheer scale of our borrowing. If Washington ever truly hit a stalemate, like not raising the debt ceiling in time and defaulted even for a few days, it would likely trigger chaos in financial markets. Even without a default, too much debt could eventually spark inflation if the central bank prints money to cover it or a currency devaluation. It's like a warning light on the dashboard. You can ignore it for a while, but if you keep pushing your luck, something could break. Burden on future generations. There's also a moral or generational argument running up such a huge bill now effectively passes the cost to younger Americans and future generations. Today's kids and unborn grandchildren are the ones who may have to pay higher taxes and endure lower government benefits because we're leaving them the tab for our choices. As one lawmaker put it, this debt is a crushing $500,000 burden for every young American under 18 if you divide it up. That's obviously not an actual bill handed to every child, but it illustrates the point that the next generation will inherit a government constrained by massive debt. They'll either have to pay it down or face the consequences of carrying it. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Remember, the U.S. has been in deep debt before and managed to get out of it. After World War II, for instance, the debt was huge, but we grew out of it without defaulting. Some economists also argue that as long as the U.S. borrows in its own currency, the dollar, it can technically never be forced into default. It can always print more money to pay debts, though that has other consequences like inflation. And indeed, to this day, investors still trust U.S. bonds, largely because the U.S. has a strong record of paying and a very large economy. In fact, despite all the alarm, some point out a paradox. Even at $38 trillion, about 125% of GDP, the U.S. is not in immediate crisis. We're not Greece or Venezuela. We still finance our debt at relatively low rates, and the world hasn't dumped the dollar. This gives a bit of reassurance that we're not about to implode tomorrow. However, most experts agree that our current trajectory is not healthy or sustainable long term. You can only tempt fate for so long. The easy times of low rates and cheap debt are likely over. If we keep adding trillions at the current pace, we could face a situation where simply paying interest and mandatory expenses, like Social Security and Medicare, consumes virtually all federal revenue, leaving nothing for anything else. Clearly, something's got to give eventually. The sooner we address it, the less painful it might be. So, how do we not let $38 trillion turn into $50 trillion or $100 trillion? The solutions are straightforward to say, but hard to do. Spend less, collect more revenue, grow the economy faster, or some combination of all three. After analyzing the debt problem, economists at RAND concluded that to significantly reduce the debt burden relative to GDP over the next 30 years, the U.S. would likely need a mix of lower and more efficient spending, higher revenues, and faster growth. There's no magic bullet. It requires tough choices. That might mean reforms to slow the growth of Social Security and Medicare costs, potentially raising the retirement age or trimming benefits for the wealthy. It could mean tax reforms that increase revenue, whether through higher rates or closing loopholes. And it certainly means finding ways to boost economic growth, perhaps through innovation, infrastructure, education, so that GDP rises and makes the debt load more manageable. The sooner policymakers act, the more gradual and gentle the adjustments can be. If they wait until a full-blown crisis, the medicine will be much more bitter. Unfortunately, as of now, there isn't much political appetite for serious debt reduction. It's more fun for politicians to cut taxes or increase spending than to do the opposite. As one budget watchdog put it, we've become numb to these huge numbers and to the dysfunction in Washington. Budget deadlines get missed, debt ceilings turn into last-minute dramas, and meanwhile, the really big drivers of debt, like those retirement and healthcare programs, don't get addressed because they're politically touchy. There's a lot of finger-pointing and not a lot of concrete action. But at some point, reality will force action, either through a market reaction, like investors refusing to buy our debt cheaply, or a domestic bind, interest costs crowding everything else out. In the end, the story of how the U.S. debt got to $38 trillion is a tale of gradual neglect turning into a pressing problem. It's the story of many years of choices to spend a bit more here, tax a bit less there, respond to crises without fully offsetting the costs, piling up to create one giant heap of IOUs. The U.S. still has a robust economy and plenty of tools to manage this debt, but only if it recognizes the problem and works to change course. So the next time you hear that the national debt just hit another record, and believe me, at this rate you'll be hearing 39 trillion and 40 trillion before long, you'll know how it got this bad. The real question is whether we'll get our act together to slow it down, like we did after World War II, or whether we'll keep ignoring it until a true crisis forces our hand. As of now, the debt keeps climbing, but understanding its history is the first step in figuring out how to deal with it. 38 trillion and counting. Now we know how we got here, and it's up to us to decide what comes next.